Welcome everyone to the Arthur Ross Gallery's virtual program celebrating the opening of God Complex, Different Philadelphia. I'm Lynn Marsden Atlas, Executive Director and University Curator. It's great to be back on campus this fall and to experience the energy and the excitement at Penn. With the 2020 grant from the Sachs Program for Arts Innovation, the Office of the Curator invited Roberto Lugo, a Philadelphia-based artist, ceramicist, social activist, poet, and educator, to curate an exhibition drawn from the Penn Art Collection with over 8,000 objects. Working virtually on the project during the pandemic, Lugo's own works are installed in dialogue with Penn's portrait collection in the Arthur Ross Gallery. So the show is actually a collaboration with the artist, the Wexler Gallery, the Office of the Curator, and the Arthur Ross Gallery. It's been a great pleasure to work with Roberto, and I want to personally thank him for this inspiring exhibition. I also extend special thanks to Louis and Sherry Wexler and Matt Tomaseko at the Wexler Gallery for so generously lending works to the exhibition. Special shout outs to Izzy Oberlander, Griff Jurchek, and Henry B. Robinson, and all the staff at the Robert Lugo studio for their contributions. Support for God Complex, Different Philadelphia has been provided by the Sachs Program for Arts Innovation. I want to especially thank John McInerney, Chloe Ryson, and the Sachs Program Committee. Additional support has been provided by the J&AR Foundation, Bill and Kathy Hones, the Patrons Circle, the Office of the Curator, and the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts. Special thanks to Interim Provost Beth Winkelstein, Mark Dingfield, and the Arthur Ross Advisory Board for their support. I am especially grateful to Lynn Smith-Dolby, Collections Manager and Registrar at the Office of the Curator, for introducing me to Roberto's work, and who, along with Heather Muktaderi, Sarah Stewart, and Suzanne Seisman, and our summer interns, Lily Smith and Alice Sang, have been involved in all aspects of this exhibition while working remotely. Please join us tonight for our in-person but hybrid opening. To offer a safe and enjoyable experience, face masks are required at all times inside our building. We recommend advance registration at www.arthurrossgallery.org, but walk-ins are also welcome. We take these precautions seriously so that you can confidently visit the space to enjoy this remarkable exhibition. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Roberto Lugo, as I mentioned before, is an American artist, ceramicist, social activist, spoken word poet, and educator. And since I have one right here, I'd like to share an example of one of his more modest works, a cup that he has created that also has a self-portrait on it with Roberto. Lugo uses porcelain as his medium of choice, illuminating its aristocratic surface with imagery of poverty, inequality, and social and racial justice. Lugo's works are multicultural mashups, traditional European and Asian porcelain forms, and techniques that are reimagined with a 21st century street sensibility. Their hand-painted surfaces feature classic, decorative patterns and motifs combined with elements of modern urban graffiti, and portraits of individuals whose faces are historically absent on this type of luxury item. People like Sojourner Truth, Dr. Cornel West, and the Notorious Big, as well as Lugo's family, and very often himself. Roberto Lugo holds a BFA from the Kansas City Art Institute and an MFA from Penn State. He is currently an assistant professor at Tyler School of Art and Architecture in Philadelphia. The artist's work is currently on view at the Currier Museum of Art in Manchester, New Hampshire, in a solo exhibition entitled Roberto Lugo, Traigo mi lelola, I Bring You My Joy. And his work was also recently on view in New Grit, Art and Philly Now at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. His work has been featured in shows at the Crystal Bridges Museum of Art, the Houston Center for Contemporary Craft, the Museum of Arts and Design in New York, among many others. He's recipient of numerous awards, including a 2019 Pew Fellowship, a Cynthia Hazen-Polsky and Leon Polsky Rome Prize, and a U.S. Artists Award. His work is found in the permanent collections widely across the states, Metropolitan Museum of Art, at the LA County Museum, Philadelphia Museum of Art, the High Museum, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, the Brooklyn Museum, the Walters Art Museum, and many more. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce Roberto.
Home of cornbread tagging in the streets, home of Chinese restaurants that speak Spanish, the corner stores that sell relleno de papas, home of Philly blunts and silly stunts, fire hydrant afternoons with you and your buddies. It's the ways the shoes affect people. It's the penny candies and the football with no pads, home of mom saying bye to the boys too young, home of everything happening too young, home of baseball bats to the face for stepping in the wrong neighborhood. Here you can get your sofrito and your patelas out somebody's house window, home of a lot of abuelas praying and feeding their chihuahuas leftover rice. That's where we is. That cologne on a windbreaker sort of fresh. Go to the store and get an iced tea and a honey bun. Home of everybody ignoring the gunshots they heard because they didn't want to break up the conversation. I'm from there. Hi, everybody. Welcome to my talk. I'm really excited about this exhibition, and I'm really excited to talk to you about it. So for those of you who don't know a lot about me, I grew up in Philly. I grew up in a part of Philadelphia known as Kensington. You know, I never really had a lot of experience with art growing up. A lot of my experience with art was through the mural program, seeing the murals in the streets, doing graffiti myself. And so a lot of those things influence who I am and what it is that I do. But I didn't really start to work in visual art until my 20s. And, you know, I don't want to get into too much of a biographical conversation, but what I do want to bring up is that I've lived in Philadelphia as an artist for 4 years now. And when I first came back, it was a really different experience. It was a different Philadelphia. And, you know, the people that I grew up with didn't really understand what it is that I was doing. And the people that I found myself around didn't really understand the nuances of where it is that I grew up. And so a lot of times that can be a really lonely place. And I really wanted to figure out a way to engage with the community here in Philadelphia. And so that takes place in a lot of different ways. I'm currently working on a mural with Mural Arts. My gallery representation is in Philadelphia, and I got this great opportunity to work with the Arthur Ross Gallery at the University of Pennsylvania. And initially it started with me wanting to, you know, curate a show based off of the collection. But one of the things that I experienced that I think like many people was that and honestly, a reason why I make the work I do is because I didn't see a lot of representation in terms of the people that were painted or the concepts or ideas, but then also makers that are people of color or women or, you know, anybody other than a white man. And so it really struck me that, you know, that aspect of it, you know, really struck me, and it started to get me thinking about how when, you know, I was a kid and we would do trips, we would go to places like, you know, Independence Hall and, you know, see the Liberty Bell. And, you know, for the most part, you tend to see the same narrative told over and over again. And as a history lover, I love a lot of these objects, you know, but as a contemporary artist, I feel like one of my roles is to complicate that narrative and to ask a lot of what ifs, you know, like what if, you know, a lot of these collections didn't just mostly have white men painted by white men. And so that's an exploration that I'm looking at. And so This exhibition for me really started with the last piece that we just showed with Ben Franklin and my father. And this piece is called Bridges. And ironically enough, this piece was created prior to me having the exhibition. And the reason why is because my father would ride his bike over the Ben Franklin Bridge in order to get to work in New Jersey. And that idea has always stuck with me, the idea that people have to labor so hard that they ride their bike for over an hour just to get started. And it reminds me of how all the people that came before me had to do so much for me to have what it is that I have. And so I exhaust my life trying to pay homage to those people and feeling like it's my responsibility to represent those stories. And so, this particular piece has some of the architecture of the Ben Franklin Bridge, and Ben Franklin on one side and my father on another side. It's also my pleasure to share that this piece is going to be part of the permanent collection for the Penn Museum. And so I'm really proud of that. And my father is too. I told him, Dad, you're going to be a part of this museum. And he was really thrilled. So let's look at the next slide. So one of my ideas was to create this space in the gallery where, you get a sense of what it's been like, going into museum. And, a lot of these figures, there's complicated feelings about, to be honest. But they are part of history, and they are part of the history that I grew up learning about, and so the actual color that's in this room is a color match for the interior of Independence Hall. And I'd like to thank Lynn Atlas and Dolby for doing the hard work of getting that. And then these, incredible historic portraits, gilded in gold, and are really reminiscent of some of the ideas that I started with in my work. I started to look at these objects, and then I grew in this hope that now I have the autonomy as an artist to make work and complicate that history and share what it would look like for people of color to be on these, for people that are different, that have different backgrounds, people that grew up poor. And so really a lot of my work speaks from my own personal experience, because I can't really speak for anyone else. So after you come into this first room, and even though it's this sort of bluish color, I call it the gray room, you fold into an area that's what I'm referring to my Philadelphia. So if we can start to look at that. So you see this intersection when you first come in. Actually, if we can go back to the last slide, that'd be great. And you see the piece with my father and Ben Franklin, and for lack of a better word, being a bridge for the two galleries. And in the background here, you can see this gorgeous Prometheus vase, which is part of the museum's collection. And it was actually restored to put on exhibit just for this show. So again, the effort that was put together by getting some of the most, some of the most important objects from the university as a whole, and borrowing these from all different places. And this collection goes as far back as Ben Franklin, which I think is a really important thing to note, because thinking about where this thing is starting at to where it's at today, where this museum, and its curators have the autonomy to hire someone like me who's from the same place, and to be able to tell a story that's different than what you would imagine in a university's collection. So let's look at the next slide here. So, this is when you're looking forward, you see this Ben Franklin image, but then you see the exterior of it. And, interestingly enough, some of the figures like a Ben Franklin is more synonymous with money in the community that I grew up with, Benjamins, as we call them. And one of the things that's really interesting that I want people to be aware of and to make apparent is, my particular relationship with these people were different growing up. Like, I didn't really look at these people, not necessarily Ben Franklin, but some of the others is, people who own slaves, or people who are oppressors. Growing up, I just thought of Ben Franklin as somebody who was an inventor, somebody who was a creative, and somebody who's from Philadelphia. And so, it's more about the icon, the iconography for me than it is about that particular person and their history, and the iconography and what that represents. The way that I would identify today is a sort of white dominance, a white supremacy, a God complex, something where we are designed in the systems that we exist in to look at the white man as the epitome of existence, and to be able to look at history and see all these achievements that are done by white men as like as a receipt or a relic of how great they are. But in reality, part of that is the opportunities that they were given. And so in this exhibition, I'm exploring some other figures that I feel like are revolutionary and influential to the culture that and the opportunities that I have. So the entire interior of the exhibition was spray painted. And again, thank you for allowing us to do this, because this isn't something that normally you get to do in a museum or gallery, experience, which is me and Chop, who is a graffiti artist that I work with, got to go in and just, paint the walls as we wanted. And these walls are painted with the names of the people who taught me how to do graffiti growing up. And it was an amazing experience, because I was thinking about, well, what do I do with the walls? This room where you go in has all these historic pieces, and then what I'm trying to do is represent and create these relationships where you can see the beauty of something like a graffiti, and how it takes a lot of skills to be able to do those things. And also how graffiti is very reminiscent to how we use pottery. Graffiti is, sort of anthropologic in some ways. We think of like ancient Greece and the notion of sgraffito, carving into a wall, sharing notes, but also in graffiti is about making sure that you existed, and that other people know that you exist, and putting your name in all these places so that you mattered, your life means something. And I think that comes from people who don't have access to art classes and who still are creatively inclined. And so I view graffiti as an art movement of overcoming oppression. And so for me, I think graffiti is really beautiful. And as someone who grew up doing it, it's a different skill set than what I thought of. When I was doing it as a kid, it was really more about just like putting my name up. But through the years, as I've become more familiar with how graffiti is done, there's so many layers and so many subtleties to the line work, to the colors, to the highlighting. There's a real artistry when it comes to graffiti. And then there's these really beautiful moments that are happening in the gallery. For example, this photograph from the museum's collection, when it was placed here, it happened to be placed on an area that had this halo on it. And that wasn't pre-planned. That just happened to come together during the installation. Let's look at the next slide. So everybody, this is the color red. We're getting there. So while we're figuring this out, one of the things, let's go ahead and play this video so you can get a sense. The graffiti that's happening in the gallery isn't just sort of like something we pre-planned and just like sort of put up. We sort of went in with a layering effect, and that's very purposeful. One of the reasons why is because one of my arguments with graffiti is that, it is an art form of resistance. And one of the reasons why I feel like that is because think about how often graffiti gets covered up. If you see here on the left hand side of this video, you'll see the white square, which is also known as buff. And I always found it so interesting that the city covers up graffiti, even in areas where, trash is really a problem, and, drugs are on the street, and, sex work, and all these children are exposed to dangerous situations. but it's the graffiti that gets covered up. And, you know, a lot of people would think, well, that's because it's easy, but I think it's because there's a threat that's happening when someone does graffiti. There's a freedom and autonomy of voice that is happening that I think threatens a culture and society whose systems are built on white male dominance. And so, you know, if you think about a place and you want to prevent progress from happening, you want to stifle anywhere where people have their freedoms and their autonomy. And if you don't, you know, you take away their art classes, but then, you know, even after that art class, they still will draw on the walls, and they still will beat on the tables in the classrooms and make music that way. And, you know, I think that all of these forms that I grew up with really are modes of resistance. So I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the individual works that are in this gallery. I want to pull up here. So one of the really interesting things, or I should say something that I find interesting, is that the teapot drawings that are happening here in the background, and then the teapots being in front of them are like definitely not something that we pre-planned. You know, I've had this weird relationship with graffiti ever since I started making pottery, because it's like, it's, for me, is it's more of a, you know, a part of my childhood, just like, you know, television was, or just like, you know, the snacks that I grew up eating. They're a response to that living. And then you know, as I'm doing graffiti, you know, this teapot on the left here was painted by Chop, and then the one on the right in the background was painted by me. And, you know, I was just thinking, well, how do I figure out how to synthesize, you know, where I'm at as an artist, and then my background. And so I started painting some of these teapots. And then I'd love to talk to you about some of the figures that are in here. So if we can go to the next slide here. This is Carolyn LeCount, which is, she was a teacher and civil rights activist who fought for discrimination on public transit, and the POC educators like herself. And then the next slide, Crystal Bird Fawcett, the first African-American woman elected to the state legislature in the country, chosen in 1938 to represent the 18th District of Philadelphia. And in that role, she advocated for public health, low-income housing, and women's rights. She also served in President FDR's committee to promote civil rights, and gave over 200 lectures about African-American culture during her lifetime. The next teapot, some of you may recognize her, Marian Anderson, famous singer and civil rights activist, often remembered as the world's greatest contralto because of her incredible vocal range. And among her many accomplishments, she was the first African-American to perform at the Metropolitan Opera in New York City. She was a delegate for the United Nations Human Rights Commission, and she was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom and the Kennedy Center Honors, National Medal of Arts, and Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. The next piece is Sadie Tanner Moselle Alexander, the first Black female lawyer in PA and civil rights advocate. She was also the first Black woman to graduate from Penn Law, you know, so bringing it back here, and the first in the country to earn a PhD in economics. Among her many accomplishments, she helped author President Truman's report on civil rights. So really important figure. And then lastly, we have here Dr. Rebecca Cole, whose likeness appears twice in this exhibition. She's the second Black woman to become a doctor in the United States, and a staunch advocate for women in low-income communities. In 1873, she created the Women's Directory Center, which specialized in legal and medical services for poor women and children, often in their own homes. So I really wanted to highlight people that, you know, people might not recognize right off the bat, but these are, you know, my George Washingtons and my Ben Franklins and my ancestry that created all these things for me to then be able to choose something like going to college for pottery, you know? And you know, what's interesting, I think today is like, I'm working with a lot of students, and I have a few students of color that I work with at Tyler, which is, you know, really something that one of the reasons why primarily I'm an educator is I want to, you know, create quality educational programming for those students when they're in college. And I think part of that comes from having faculty and educators that understand at least part of their experience, or at least can empathize in a real way. And so, you know, when I think of some of these figures, you know, and I think about what it is that I'm trying to do, you know, today students are starting to get to the point where, you know, they're questioning whether or not, as a person of color, they want to make work about their identity. You know, why are they forced to do that, or why do they feel forced to do that? Even in a scenario where I'm somebody who, when I was in college trying to make production pottery, could never really be about production pottery. It always winded up centering around my race and where I came from, because the way I spoke, the way I thought differently, the things that I was interested in was so different than my peers. And so much of that comes from where I'm from. Can we look at the next slide? So this is also a painting of Rebecca Cole. And this is a collaboration between myself and a former student of mine and somebody who I collaborate with, Molly Hutter. And this piece is also part of the permanent collection of the Penn Museum. We donated this piece because I feel like it is such a, I just love the way that it came out. And I feel like it's a really great representation of what we were trying to do in this exhibition, which is, you know, we have a woman and a man of color painting a woman of color. And, you know, that is a much different process than I think what historically has happened in art altogether. And, you know, the idea here is to celebrate these figures and to talk about all of our achievements in a way that is a celebration and is an acknowledgement of our past, but at the same time, understanding that we are a valuable people, that we have our own history and culture that needs to be celebrated. And I really hope that people who are visiting this gallery will be able to see that passion, you know, in the works that are created. Can we go to the next piece? So I love the pots that I made for this show, and I call these street pots. And one of the reasons why is because rather than throwing on the potter's wheel, I really wanted to think about this idea of me being a potter in the community, and a village potter, and that maybe in this scenario I wouldn't have a potter's wheel, and I'd be making pottery out of coils, and those coils would you know, eventually have some of the texture of the walls and the stucco and the layering of the buildings, all of our historic buildings that you see as you cross the street, but then also the portraits from your arts, and then the stencils and the graffiti that people do so often in Philly. And then this particular piece, the sort of the setup behind it is an Amari style sort of way of decorating a pot, Amari being a Japanese style of decorating a pot. And this also has some textiles that are from the continent of Africa as well as South America. And so I'm really trying to hybridize and think about some of these cultures that we have traditionally looked at in American studio pottery, such as European ceramics and Asian ceramics, but then how do we also represent some of the textiles and imagery of communities of color who also have just as good artistry and quality and skills. And then the figures that I'm painting in here, in this particular one, it's Barack Obama and Slick Rick. And I think that people have a bias in terms of how they think about people's contributions, you know, like, you know, Obama's upbringing and Slick Rick's upbringing are very different, but they both are people who contributed to culture and to me having the opportunities that I did, and me having the style that I do. And the narrative comes from Slick Rick. And, you know, this sort of sense of style and being proud of oneself comes from hip hop. And, you know, Barack Obama, I tend to think of a fearlessness, a calmness, and somebody who has to live in this liminal space where you're getting critique from both sides, because he's not as liberal as people would want him to be. He's not conservative as some people want him to be. And then people hate him just on the fact that he's not a white person in a position of power. So all those feelings are things that I can really empathize with. Let's go to the next slide. So these columns that are here that you'll see in the gallery are actually from Philadelphia, and then the wood that was created to use to make the columns are also from the floors from homes in Philadelphia. And I was able to get all this material from Beatty American and Architectural Salvage here in Philadelphia. And Bob Beatty has been working for a very long time on keeping materials from Philadelphia architecture so that they're not lost. And so I built these columns to show my work on thinking about the streets of Philadelphia and building structures that can then hold the pots that also represent my culture, my community. And so these particular columns are from a historically Black church in Philadelphia that was torn down. So on this piece on the right-hand side is Harriet Tubman. And on this slide is Harriet Tubman on the left and Jimi Hendrix on the right-hand side. And the format, again, is this Mari style. And, you know, I really wanted to represent this dialogue in different colors. And, you know, there's a lot of diversity in my practice in terms of line quality, which actually stems from my relationship with graffiti, the line quality, but then also the colors, and thinking about how do I juxtapose colors? Like, how do I take an Amari style, but then use the colors that you would use in an African textile? And then being able to like overlap those things in a way that are easily understood, but also harmonized. And in some ways, what I'm trying to do is give people a visual representation of what the beauty of racial diversity is. Because I think a lot of times people think it's a charitable cause, but in reality, it's what creates a richness and a vibrancy within our cultures and community. And the more diverse a community you have, the more distinct you become within that community. If you're surrounding yourself with people that look and act like you, you are not unique within that culture. But the more that you surround yourself with different people, the more that they want to know about you and the more that you probably want to investigate about them. Can we look at the next slide? So lastly, the image on the right is author Zora Neale Hurston, and then on the right is Alma Thomas. And, you know, the bottom actually has this graffiti that, you know, honestly looks a lot more like the graffiti I grew up doing, which is really these sort of like block letters and anything goes. But, you know, in my work, I really try to shed light and promote and portray images of people of color, but also a wide range of them. Like you have a hip hop artist in Slick Rick, a president, you have an author in Zora, you have, you know, a painter in Alma. And the thing is these people are not doing it in the way that you would imagine. I think like one of the troubles with what it is that I do is like, I can be so stereotypical in some ways, but I have to swallow that and like, you know, understand that rapping and graffiti and the things that I do those are the tools that I've been given, you know, like that's what I was given growing up. And so I add pottery to it and this is what comes out of it, but I can't make anything else, you know? And so like, if there's a criticism in that stereotype, I think what we have to do is work on this, you know, educational systems and the opportunities so that people maybe have more diverse backgrounds to be able to have more tools to work with. All right, let's look at the next slide. So this is the last slide we're going to show. On the left-hand side is a triple beam scale. And, you know, the triple beam scale is really partly something that I look at, you know, as almost like a self-portrait, because there's this great irony in how I see a lot of things. Like growing up, when I would see Abraham Lincoln, you know, I didn't think to myself, you know, Honest Abe. I remember that Abraham Lincoln was the blue man on the $5 food stamp. And then when I get to studio and I start making pottery or mixing glazes, and I see a triple beam scale, this is something that people use to get exact measurements in pottery, but also it's a device that's used to weigh out drugs. And in a lot of the music I grew up listening to, and a lot of the experiences I had in my life, a triple beam has a certain connotation. And so I really wanted to create a triple beam scale, and I chose to paint it and carve it with a Greek pattern, because Greek pottery is how we understand a lot about Western culture. And so thinking about how pottery and lasts for thousands of years, and it's been used by anthropology to tell us a lot about cultures in the past, I really wanted to create an object that sort of like talks a little bit about how a triple beam is used today. And, you know, whether you like it or not, if you don't like it, then, you know, we need to do the work to make sure that those things don't exist anymore. I want to thank you all for coming to this talk. I'm really, wanted to talk primarily about this exhibition that I'm really proud of. I'm also going to be there today at the opening at about 5:30 if you'd like to meet in person. I also created some custom stickers that I'll be giving out for free to people who are able to make it. So I think at this time, I want to turn it over to Lynn Dolby, and then we'll take some questions from the folks who've joined us.
Hi, Rob. Thank you so much for that. And congratulations on this incredible show. It has just been my pleasure to get to work with you and your team during this past year or so. So everyone, my name is Lynn Dolby. I'm the collections manager and registrar for the university's art collection. And at this time, I'd like to invite all of you, if you have any questions or comments for Roberto, to drop them in the Q&A. And I've been enjoying looking at the chat and seeing where everyone is zooming in from. And we've got people joining us, our colleagues at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Monticello, the Currier, the Penn Museum. So it's great to see all of you. Thank you so much for being here. We do have one question in the Q&A, and this comes to us from Jessa. And Rob, Jessa says, given Penn's legacy, what do you think it means for someone with your life experience to be exhibiting here? Does this come into the conversation with the subject and goals of your artwork in any way?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, like I think, you know, not just Penn, to be honest, most, you know, institutions that have, that are centuries old, it's very complicated and something that I think about a lot. And then here's the thing is, you know, before last year, I gave, I stopped at 57. I gave 57 lectures within a 4-year period. And in that time, I gave talks at Yale, I gave talks at Harvard, I gave talks at juvenile detention centers, elementary schools, boarding schools. And it's important for people like me to do the work in a lot of different places, because, you know, these institutions that hold a lot of power, I want to be able to chip away at these people who are in positions of power to get them to understand these experiences and to understand why we're doing the work. So these are realities and not just people relying or you know, using the history of oppression to be able to get ahead. This is my reality, and the part that's really important for a place like U of Penn, being such a you know, preeminent institution, like internationally known, is that my Philadelphia exists in the same Philadelphia that Penn exists in, you know? And so, you know, kind of pulling back the curtain, I think like the curators, you know, really did, you know, this is really just even inviting artists like me in many ways can be pushing the boundaries. But then on top of it, to give me the autonomy to even like criticize the collection and make work in response to it and acknowledge its history, I think is the kind of work that really needs to be done. And so I think that it's especially important to do work like this in these places, because I think we have a lot of people that want to support artists like myself, but it's kind of like at some point I need to figure out, like I can't tell other people how to do their work or the right way to do stuff. I just know that I have the capacity to do this work. And so because I've been given these opportunities, I feel like it's my responsibility to work with institutions like this in order to move the goalposts in the right direction, which is us acknowledging these histories, doing away with celebrating just one type of narrative, and to be able to explore and support artists and thinkers with a lot of different experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think the way that we had to work together over the course of the pandemic was we, just so everyone knows, we were able to give Roberto special access to our collections database because it wasn't possible for us to meet in person. And so Roberto really got a chance to see what the Penn collection looks like. And I think your very generous donations of those two pieces they're really transformative for the collection, because you really saw firsthand that there is a real lack of diversity in the collection. And that's something that the university and we are really trying to change. So thank you for that. Okay, so we have a lot of questions coming in, and I'm just going to move this one to the top because I think this is a fun one. And it is, what piece is your son, Otto, most curious about?
Otto is definitely the painter. So he would be more curious. He's more curious about the painted pedestals than anything else. It's interesting because Otto is about to be 3 and my son Theo is just turned 7. And Theo is, even since he's been a child, has been much more interested in, a malleable plastic clay and sculpting. And when they both come to my studio, Otto wants nothing to do with clay. He just wants the brushes and the paint. And that gets me thinking a lot of times how, like, a lot of these instincts are things we're born with. So I really do learn a lot of things from my kids. Oh, you want to come? Come here. Speaking of the devil, you say hi? And then he's even got his painting smock on.
Hello, welcome.
Okay, Otto. I'm gonna let you go paint. Look, you got plenty of things to paint it right there. Okay.
How did you get interested in classic pottery shapes and designs? This attendee says, it's wonderful how you have subverted this medium and how clearly you're able to convey your ideas.
Yeah, well, okay, so that's actually a really great question. I mean, they're all great questions, but I like that question because it helps me to say something that I didn't get to say. When I went to school for ceramics, one of the things that I realized was trying to develop new forms that no one's ever seen before. And then on top of it, talk about the content that I was doing was too much all at once, And so I see a lot of the forms that I create as like a canvas, almost like buying a white plain canvas to then tell the story. Because, I think a lot of times, I'm sure some people would get it if I made a whole new form and then decorated it with all, but, I feel like with art, people only spend like 3 seconds on average with a piece of art, and for me, what that means is like, if there's too much going on, they're not going to pay attention. And so one of the things that I try to do with my art is make it layered where, you could get something in 3 seconds, but also there's things to be discovered if you spent the time with it. And so the classic shapes I almost look at as the bridge, to be able to get people, because these classic shapes also have connotations to them, right? Like the shape of an urn, reminds you of death, and then the shape of a teapot usually means you sitting down with someone else or you being able to have the time to rest and be in conversation. And so all of those connotations that different shapes have come into play with how I make.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I love in this show the juxtaposition between the textures of the street pots next to the forms of the teapots. And I think anyone who comes into this exhibition is really going to be struck by that sort of interplay of those two forms together.
Absolutely.
We have a question from John from the Sachs Program, who generously supported us. So thank you, John, for being here. He asks, what advice does Roberto have for faculty and art centers at Penn on how to better get students engaged with the arts and dialogue with artists in Philadelphia?
I think is opportunities for people to have autonomy over programming, over things like being able to be free. You know, like I think one of the things that happens nowadays that like is hard for me is like a criticism can often mean the end of a conversation. You know, like I see something this way and you are guilty of this and it's over, you know, and I feel more like what needs to happen is there needs to be a back and forth between institutions and its students and its faculty and, you know, everyone who works there, because, you know, just because you work for Penn doesn't mean that you believe in everything that they do or that you're proud of their history. You know, some people like me, I work at Tyler and I really want to work on, you know, challenging a lot of the things that's been wrong there, you know, and that's part of my responsibility. And so unless we open up these conversations, we don't actually figure out what the problems are. And so I think, like, for example, John, in this exhibition, I was able to invite a dear friend of mine, Levi Bentley, who is a poet locally in Philadelphia, and they're commissioning other artists to make poetry inspired by the exhibition. And in that sense, I'm inviting people that have no relationship with Penn, no relationship with the exhibition, but live and breathe in Philadelphia and have an entirely different experience than I do, to have their voice heard. And I think the more that you allow people to have their voice heard, I think the more people feel like at least they're getting the opportunity to be engaged and they're not being told how to feel. And I think that's really the most important thing, when you can create more open-ended opportunities for people to like share in that and experience it.
Absolutely. So anyone who follows you on Instagram knows that you have a very deep connection to music. So can you talk a little bit about how music inspires you and how it helps you with your process?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the questions I ask my students, and I encourage anybody is free to use this, but I ask my students what are their two favorite senses. And you know, mine's change over time, but most often it's, for me, it's smell and taste. And a lot of times it's sound, because I think sound and smell gives me nostalgia, and it's a sublime experience that I can't quite say with words. And so a lot of times you can tell what I was listening to. You can tell what I was listening to through the objects that I'm making, because they're in direct response to that. Like when the work seems much more confident and less apologetic, I was probably listening to hip hop. When the work is more sensitive, I'm probably listening to my wife's emo music. But you know, for me, hip hop has a lot to do with attitude, and it's a really strange dynamic to be in, because hip hop is about confidence, and hip hop is about talking about how great you are. Like every rapper is like saying, I'm the greatest of all time. And like, what if artists were to do that? Like, what if I were to, you know, come up here and be like, man, don't you see my pottery is amazing? Like everybody would drop out of this call, right? And then, you know, you have, we're often talking about, you know, being more open and having more open and supportive communities. But then at the same time, you have to understand that you're going to be inviting people in that don't believe in all the things that you believe in. And so are you really an open community? Or, you know, so for me, like openness and diversity really has to do with autonomy and giving people the ability to speak and not shut them out. And that's everybody, not just choosing who gets to do that, but everybody. And so it's an interesting dynamic to be a person of color and to also be involved in hip hop, but then also like teach in a visual arts experience where most of the people don't have the background that I do, still listen to hip hop and understand the culture, but from afar. And so all of that criticism comes from a place of like not really understanding it, because like, you know, if you grow up in a place like, for example, with pottery, you know, like I understand that the only way to interact with pottery is not just to own it, you know, and the reason why is because I come from a culture where people, they're worried about what they're going to eat. So they're not worried about what they're eating out of. you know, and so if you come from that place, you understand that what you're trying to say is more important than somebody else owning it. And so that's why I make work in many different layers. Like I make cups, like what Lynn Atlas showed earlier, that, you know, your average person could probably save up to buy, but then I also make pieces that take me months to make. So, you know, maybe only a museum can afford that. But, you know, now it's in a public place where people can see it and interact with it in that way. And they know that that thing exists.
Thank you. So what's next for you? What are you working on now?
Right now, there's a couple of things. Well, I just I'm in a really incredible exhibition that's coming up at the Metropolitan Museum. It's an Afrofuturistic period room entitled "Before We Could Fly." And I encourage everyone to there's information on that in the Met website. And then next year, I have an exhibition in Philadelphia where I'm working with the graffiti artists that you see here, and we're sort of creating a pop-up store in Philadelphia, and that's going to be at Wexler Gallery. I believe that opens on October 21st or 22nd. Next year, I'm doing an artist residency at the Grounds for Sculpture, and one of the things I have planned is a 30-foot tall pot that's a DJ booth. So please keep your eye on that. And then lastly, I have a solo exhibition at the Hermitage that opens next May. And I'll be doing residencies at both of those places. So I'm very busy, but it's the thing that makes me feel like my life matters. And so I have to keep working, you know, because it's the thing that makes me feel like I even existed. And so, and then I see it in so many people. Like I can't tell you how many times I have an exhibition and somebody who I've never met before will cry with me, or share an experience with me that was traumatic or something that made them feel seen. And so whenever I have those experiences, it just reminds me like I gotta keep going, because, you know, like there's something I'm doing with my life that's changing people's lives and creating opportunities. And like, I fought so hard to have this that I don't want to let it go.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And Anna from the Met just dropped a link in the chat for everyone about your project that you'll have there. So thank you. Okay. There was just one last question in the chat that I wanted to bring your attention to, and then we'll wrap this up. It's from Andrew, who asks, Roberto, can you talk a little bit about how your pottery references historic porcelains usually reserved for the very wealthy of the 18th and 19th centuries? Archaeology reveals that enslaved and free Black communities of the same time period also bought and traded and enjoyed expensive porcelains. I would just love to have your thoughts on this kind of unintended use of these materials.
Yeah, well, you know, that's really at the center of why I use the material. You know, at the time, you know, we're talking about, early 19th century, porcelain was considered more expensive than gold. And there was actually wars fought over porcelain. In the book, The Arcanum, Germany, the king of Germany stole some of the world's best scientists with the hopes of creating the recipe for porcelain and gold. And so I think about things like, for example, I had an exhibition at the Walters Museum, and I made a potpourri boat that was originally made by Sev. And in this home, it was the home of a secessionist enslaved person owner. And this type of boat would have been on the mantle, because if you think about it, porcelain being this really expensive object, it was at the forefront. And I was just thinking about how backwards it was for somebody to have a potpourri object that's a boat, and that's showing some of the innovation by some of the European colonizers that came over, and having a home with enslaved people that lived there who had an entirely different traumatic experience with ships, and their experience with a ship and smell, it's so different. And it's just completely backwards and ignorant and ununderstanding of someone's experience. And so I think about those things a lot because like now I think about the fact that all those enslaved people and the civil rights activists and all the people that came before me that I'm honoring in this exhibition have, what they've done is created an opportunity for me to now have the autonomy to make the maker with this porcelain and choose what I get to make at it. And then I get to go back and honor the people that, you know, should be honored on these objects, in my opinion. And so for me, it's very important to take these objects of what people think is wealth, you know, because like I think, for example, the idea of royalty, a lot of times it's synonymous with wealth, but I don't think being royal or regal has anything to do with the amount of money that you have. I think, you know, regalness for me, like I feel like that's why in the hood we call people kings and queens, because it has a lot to do with how people respect you and admire you within the community. And so for me, these people are respected and admired, and I wish to use the medium for them that best suits that, which in a lot of cases is porcelain.
All right, thank you so much. I will see you tonight at the opening, and I'm gonna hand it back over to Lynn Marcinellis. Thanks, everyone.
Lynn, you're on mute right now.
I'm on mute. Roberto, thank you so much for this incredible conversation, which we will continue this evening with all of you. The other thing I wanted to say is that the university collection, since the time of Ben Franklin, has been entirely created by gifts. So your gifts, Roberto, are incredible. And I'm so grateful for Bridges and Dr. Rebecca Cole, because they are a way of us changing the narrative and the legacy of the University of Pennsylvania. And they will be incredibly valuable to starting conversations all across the campus and for the next couple of centuries as well. So thank you all for joining us. I am deeply moved by your passion, Roberto, and by the opportunity to work with you. It has been an incredible experience. And I remember when you said, I think I'd like to graffiti the walls. And I took my director's hat and said, gulp. Okay, you can do it between here and here, but not on the wainscoting. So it's been a great collaboration with Lynn and with you and Izzy and everybody at your studio. And we very much look forward to celebrating with all of you tonight. Thanks so much for coming, everyone. I did want to say that we have an incredible series of programs here. This is our brochure, but we have 8 different programs this fall to engage all kinds of communities, and you are all welcome. As always, the Arthur Ross Gallery is free to everyone, and we welcome you all to come. Thank you again, Roberto, and we look forward to seeing everyone tonight.